The rain was relentless that night, pounding against the roof of the small cabin like an army of drummers. It wasn't supposed to be this bad. I thought I could handle a few days out in the woods. Some quiet, alone time to clear my head. The weather had seemed fine when I arrived, and the cabin itself was quaint, tucked deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. A little bit off the grid with no cell service and barely any electricity, but that was the point. I was supposed to be disconnected from the world, but now the storm felt like it was trying to swallow me whole. I had built the cabin myself, a simple structure. It was nothing grand. 2 rooms, a tiny kitchen, a wood stove, and a loft where I could sleep. It took me about 2 months to finish the construction, hauling lumber and materials from the nearby town and spending long hours working alone. It was hard, but it was rewarding. I wasn't a builder by trade, but I had always enjoyed working with my hands, and this cabin was the result of a personal project that meant more to me than I realized. The storm started out as just a drizzle. I had walked to the cabin that morning under a thick cloud cover, thinking I'd get some work done, chopping wood, perhaps, or organizing the small space. But by mid-afternoon, the rain had turned heavy, and the wind started to howl through the trees. The fire I'd started in the stove crackled and popped, adding a comforting warmth to the air. But even with the fire roaring, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was an eerie calm about the place, like it was waiting for something to happen. I didn't know it then, but I was about to find out just how alone I wasn't. The wind moaned outside as the rain continued to batter the cabin. I was sitting at the small wooden table near the window, working on some sketches for future projects. The flickering of the candlelight on the paper made it hard to concentrate, but I couldn't bring myself to turn on the generator. If I did, the noise would only remind me that I was miles from civilization. It felt good to just be still, to be in the moment, and the occasional flash of lightning outside was the only thing that broke the silence. It was around 9 p.m. when I first heard the knock. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, deliberate. At first, I thought I was imagining it, maybe hearing the wind against the door. But then it came again, 3 knocks, slow, spaced apart. I froze, my pencil dropping from my hand onto the table. My heart rate shot up, and I stood, moving slowly toward the door, my breath caught in my throat. I was alone. The nearest neighbor was at least a couple of miles away, and I hadn't seen a soul since I arrived a few days earlier. Who could possibly be out there, especially in this storm? The wind howled again, and the rain kept pounding. I stepped closer to the door, my boots creaking on the old wooden floor. I didn't want to open it. In fact, part of me screamed not to, but I had to know. So I reached out, grabbing the brass handle, and twisted it. Nothing. No one was there. I leaned out into the darkness, peering through the rain-soaked porch. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from occasional flashes of lightning. The air smelled of wet pine and earth. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. My eyes scanned the yard and the trees around the cabin, but all I saw was the relentless downpour and the swaying branches of the trees. I sighed, relieved yet uneasy. Maybe it had just been the wind, or maybe an animal brushing against the door. The more I thought about it, the more ridiculous the whole situation seemed. I closed the door and locked it again, then made my way back to the stove, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled in my stomach. I added another log to the fire and sat back down at the table, trying to focus on my sketches. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation that something wasn't quite right. Another hour passed. The rain didn't let up. The storm outside had worsened, and the wind was now tearing at the trees, making them creak and groan like they were going to snap. The fire had begun to die down, and I was just about to add another log when I heard it again. This time, the knock was louder. It was unmistakable. 3 sharp raps against the door. I stood up abruptly, knocking my chair back in the process. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I moved toward the door again, slower this time, more cautious. My hand hovered over the handle, but I hesitated. What if it wasn't a person? What if it was something else? I shook my head, trying to shake off the absurd thought. There were no things out here, no monsters or supernatural forces. This was just a cabin in the woods, and the rain was playing tricks on my mind. With a deep breath, I opened the door again, this time flinging it wide open, expecting to see nothing more than an empty porch. But as I looked into the dark night, something caught my eye. There, standing just beyond the porch, was a figure. A man, tall, wearing a heavy coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. His posture was strange, almost too still. I couldn't make out much more of him except for the vague outline of his shape. His shoulders were hunched, like he was trying to keep his body hidden from the rain. The only sound was the wind and the rain, but it felt like the world had gone eerily silent for a moment. My breath caught in my throat, and I immediately slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as I could. My heart was pounding in my ears. What the hell was that? I had never felt so afraid. I didn't know what to do. I was far from help, alone with no phone service. The cabin was my only shelter, but now I felt exposed. I stood there waiting, listening. Nothing. No knocks, no sounds. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly made my way back to the window, cautiously peering out between the curtains. The figure was gone. My hands shook as I held the curtains back just a bit. I scanned the porch, the yard, the tree line, but there was nothing, just the rain and the dark. I stood there for a long time, watching, waiting, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what I had seen, or if it had been real. Maybe it was just a figment of my imagination, a product of the storm. But then the knocking came again. This time it was followed by a voice. "Let me in." A soft, strained voice, almost drowned out by the wind and rain. I froze. My mind was racing. The figure I had seen earlier, could it have been him? For a moment, I stood still, debating what to do. But the feeling in my gut, the one that had been gnawing at me for hours, told me I couldn't stay here. I couldn't wait for whatever was out there to make another move. I grabbed my pack, threw on my raincoat, and opened the door again. But this time, I didn't step outside. Couldn't risk it. Instead, I ran to the back of the cabin, grabbed an axe from the small shed, and took off into the woods. The storm raged around me, and I could barely see through the rain, but I didn't stop. I ran as far as I could, deeper into the woods, until I finally came across the old dirt road that led to the nearest town. The rain soaked through my clothes, but I didn't care. I had to get away. Whatever was out there, whatever had knocked on my door, I didn't want to find out what it was. The rest of the night was a blur. I didn't stop running until I reached the small town, where I was able to find shelter with a couple who owned a small bed and breakfast. They were kind enough to take me in, offering me dry clothes and a warm bed. The storm raged on for days. The cabin and the woods surrounding it were swallowed up by the relentless weather. I never went back. Some days I still wonder if the figure I saw was just a trick of my mind, if the knocking was just the wind, or if something or someone was really out there. I never got the answers, but that's the way it stays. The cabin, I've heard, is still there, abandoned and untouched, waiting for the next person to come across it. But me, I don't think I'll ever find out what truly happened that night, and I'm okay with that. I had never been to that cabin before, the place where my ex-husband, Danny, had spent so much of his time after we split up. It was supposed to be his place of solitude, something he'd always talked about getting after we broke up. I wasn't sure if he thought he could escape our past by getting away to the woods, but after we divorced, I didn't think much about it. It had been a few years since we went our separate ways. I was now living in a small town a few miles from there. The cabin, tucked deep in a forested area on the outskirts of the old mining town, had always felt like a distant thing, until one day, I received an unsettling call from one of Danny's old friends. He hadn't been responding to messages for weeks, and they needed someone who knew him well enough to check on him. I didn't want to go. I honestly didn't. The thought of returning to that part of my life made my chest tighten, and I could feel my heart pounding harder just thinking about the memories. But what was I supposed to do? Danny was stubborn. If anything was wrong, it was unlikely he'd have asked for help. I couldn't let it go on any longer. So, on a cold, crisp autumn day in early November, I made my way to the cabin. The roads were narrow, winding through tall pines and overgrown paths, much like the ones I used to drive on when Danny and I first started dating. He used to talk about how his dream was to live far away from everything, in the middle of nowhere, where he could find peace. I was hesitant at first, unsure if I wanted that kind of isolation, but I remember how his eyes lit up when he described it. That dream turned into his reality, and now it had become something I had to confront. I drove the dusty road that led to the cabin, feeling more and more uneasy the closer I got. The sun had already started to dip behind the trees, leaving the woods in shadows, a grayish blue that only added to the discomfort I felt. The place was isolated, cut off from the rest of the world by miles of dense forest, and the air had a slight chill to it, carrying the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The gravel road crunched beneath my tires, the sound echoing through the still woods. As I got closer to the cabin, I could see its silhouette rising out of the mist. The roof was weathered, and the paint on the wooden walls was peeling, leaving streaks of dull gray. The large windows, once clear, were now dusty and fogged, casting the place in a lifeless, abandoned kind of feel. For a moment, I sat in the car, staring at it, wondering if this was really necessary. But I knew I had to go. I couldn't leave things hanging like this. I stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting my skin like a slap. I walked toward the cabin, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. The silence was suffocating. Not even the sound of birds or rustling animals felt unnatural. Everything was still. I reached the porch and hesitated for a moment. The door was slightly ajar, but it didn't seem like anyone was inside. I knocked just in case, though I had no reason to think anyone would answer. I pushed the door open slowly, the wood creaking, a sound that almost seemed too loud in the silence of the woods. The smell of stale air and something faintly rotten hit me instantly. It made my stomach churn. I stepped inside. The living room was exactly how I remembered it. Dark, with mismatched furniture. A faded couch sat against one wall, and the rug in the center of the room was a little worse for wear. There were old magazines on the coffee table, some of them still half open as if someone had been reading them just days ago. But there was no sign of Danny, no sign of life at all. I called his name, but the sound felt small in the space, swallowed by the thick air. I felt a twinge of unease as I walked further into the cabin, my footsteps muffled by the old, worn wood floor. The kitchen was equally silent. The refrigerator was old, its door slightly cracked, and I noticed that there were some dishes stacked in the sink. It seemed like Danny had been here at least recently, but for some reason he hadn't bothered to clean up. I moved on to the hallway, the walls lined with pictures from years past, most of them of Danny and his friends. I paused when I reached the bedroom door, my heart beating faster now. I had to force myself to turn the knob and step inside. The room was dim, with only the pale light filtering through the grimy window. The bed was unmade, and the sheets were rumpled, as though someone had gotten up in a hurry. There were clothes scattered on the floor, and a bottle of whiskey sat on the nightstand, half empty. But Danny wasn't here. I felt my throat tighten. Where was he? I turned back toward the living room, about to head outside to check around the cabin, when I caught sight of something strange on the floor near the door. A pile of clothes, but underneath them, there was something else, something I couldn't place. I walked over to it, my curiosity getting the better of me. I froze when I saw what it was. There, hidden beneath the clothes, was a large, dark stain on the floor. I crouched down to get a closer look, my hands trembling. The stain was unmistakable. Blood. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. Danny wasn't here, and this wasn't just some spilled drink or random mess. This was real, and it was bad. I scanned the rest of the room. Nothing seemed out of place except for that. But my stomach sank further when I noticed something else. A trail of small footprints leading from the bedroom toward the back door. The door that led into the woods. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the number for Danny's friend. The call went straight to voicemail. My thoughts were clouded with panic. I couldn't just leave without knowing what had happened to him. I had to figure this out, and I had to do it quickly. I stepped outside into the cold night air, the silence even more oppressive now. I followed the footprints, which led deeper into the woods. The trees were so thick here, the branches hanging low, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, as though the forest itself was pressing in on me. After what felt like an eternity, the trail finally stopped at a small clearing. And there, lying on the ground, was Danny. I rushed over, my heart hammering in my chest. He was unconscious, his face pale, his clothes torn and covered in dirt and blood. I could see a deep gash on his arm, and his breathing was shallow. Without thinking, I knelt down and checked his pulse. It was weak, but it was there. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. I pulled out my phone and dialed emergency services, telling them my location as quickly as I could. They said they were sending help, but it felt like an eternity before they arrived. As I sat beside him, watching over him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Who had done this to him? And why? When the ambulance finally arrived, they took him away, and I was left standing in the middle of the woods, my mind spinning with unanswered questions. The next few weeks were a blur. Danny survived, but the injuries were serious. He wouldn't talk about what happened, only saying he'd been attacked by someone, but he refused to name who. The police investigated, but no one was ever arrested. Danny recovered, but we never spoke again. I couldn't bring myself to confront him, to push for answers. There were too many questions, too many things left unsaid, and I realized that some things were better left alone. In the end, I had closure, but it was the kind that left a strange emptiness, a strange peace. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened out there, whatever dark thing Danny had gotten mixed up in, would stay in those woods. It was no longer my problem, and that was the hardest part to accept. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the cabin. It was a cold night in the remote woods of northern New Mexico, 2018. I had driven out to this secluded cabin for a week-long getaway, hoping for some peace and quiet. Just me and the trees, my dog, and nothing but the soft sounds of the wind and the occasional bird call. Or at least that's how it was supposed to be. The cabin was rustic, tucked away deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road. It was the kind of place that felt cut off from the world, like a forgotten slice of the past. It wasn't fancy by any means, just a small, one-story structure with thick wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a single bedroom. I was used to being alone in places like this, and my dog, a border collie named Max, was my constant companion. He was usually calm, alert, but never seemed bothered by anything. The first few days were perfect. I hiked through the woods, enjoyed the silence, and did some reading. Max and I had our routine. but I began to feel an unsettling tension creeping in as the nights grew colder. On the fourth evening, something happened. It was around midnight when the first noise came. I had just settled into bed, Max curled up at my feet. The fire in the stove had died down, and I was just about to drift off when I heard a loud crack, followed by the sound of footsteps outside. It was heavy, too heavy for a deer or any other animal I might expect in these woods. Max immediately shot up, his ears alert. I froze, listening closely. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone walking carefully, trying not to be heard. The cabin was built solidly, but the thin walls didn't offer much protection. I could hear everything from inside. I stood up quietly, reaching for the flashlight on the nightstand. My heart pounded in my chest. Who the hell would be out there at this hour? I muttered to myself. The idea of someone hiking in the woods at night was ridiculous. Max growled lowly, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He was always calm, but tonight, something had him spooked. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and slowly made my way to the window. I peered through the glass, shining the light out into the dark expanse of the forest. My breath fogged up the window as I tried to make out any shape or movement. Nothing, just trees swaying in the wind. But then, something caught my eye, a figure. It was standing just beyond the edge of the trees, a tall, thin silhouette. It was too far for me to make out any features, but it didn't move. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to figure out if I was imagining things. The wind picked up again, and the figure seemed to sway as though it was rocking back and forth, its head turning slowly, like it was looking directly at me. Max barked, snapping me out of my trance. His growls turned to frantic barks, and I could hear him scrambling to the door. My heart dropped. I didn't know what to do. Should I go out there? Should I call someone? I set the flashlight down and grabbed my phone. No signal. Typical. I cursed under my breath and turned back to the window. The figure was still there, but now it was closer, much closer. It was standing at the edge of the porch, just outside the front door. It was moving slowly, its body jerking unnaturally as it walked. There was something about the way it moved that didn't seem right, like it was mimicking a human, but not quite getting it right. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I had heard stories about skinwalkers, creatures from Native American folklore, shapeshifters who could take on the form of animals or humans. I wasn't superstitious, but I couldn't deny the strange feeling creeping up my spine. Max stopped barking, and I heard him scratching at the door. Couldn't let him out there. I moved to the door and tried to peer through the crack at the bottom. The figure was gone. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I tried to steady myself. Maybe it had just been my imagination. Maybe I had been hearing things. Then the door handle rattled. I gasped, backing away from the door in a panic. Someone or something was trying to get in. The door rattled again, louder this time. Max growled again, and I heard him scratching and whining, trying to get to the door. Couldn't let it in. I couldn't let whatever it was near Max. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy iron skillet, and positioned myself by the door, ready to swing it if the door was forced open. But the rattling stopped. The cabin fell into an eerie silence. Then, just as I thought I could breathe again, the sound of footsteps returned. But this time, they were coming from inside the cabin. They were light and almost shuffling, dragging across the floor. The hair on my neck stood up as I realized the sound wasn't coming from the hallway but from the kitchen, right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the dark shadows and the quiet of the cabin. My mind raced. Was I losing it? Was it the stress, the isolation getting to me? But then I heard it again, faint, like a whisper. The floorboards creaked, the sound of someone walking slowly, almost as if they were trying to sneak up on me. I turned, my heart in my throat, my pulse quickening. And that's when I saw it, the figure standing in the doorway of the kitchen, its back to me. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it had the same jerky movements I'd seen earlier. But this time I saw its face. It was a twisted mockery of a human face. Pale, stretched too tight, with dark eyes that glinted in the dim light. Its features were sharp, angular, and wrong. I couldn't make out its nose, and its mouth was wide, almost too wide, stretching from ear to ear in an unnatural grin. The figure slowly turned its head to face me, and I froze. The eyes, it was the eyes that got me. They were too wide, too black, too deep. They bore into me, unblinking, like they could see through me. Max barked suddenly, running to the door, his fur standing on end. I snapped out of my trance, grabbing for my keys, my phone, anything that could help. But there was no time. The figure stepped forward, its long arms outstretched. I ran, flinging the door open, and sprinted into the night. Max was ahead of me, pulling me toward the truck parked outside. The cabin seemed to tremble behind me, the air thick with tension. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the truck, I fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. I didn't even care if I had left everything behind. Just getting out of there felt like the only thing that mattered. Max jumped into the passenger seat, panting and trembling, his eyes wide. The figure had stopped at the edge of the cabin. I didn't stop to see what it did next. I floored the gas pedal, tearing down the dirt road, not looking back until I reached the nearest town. I stayed at a small motel that night, shaking, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I left the next morning, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it had been, it wasn't human. And it wasn't something I ever wanted to encounter again. I never went back to that cabin. Some things are better left untouched. It was a bitterly cold evening in early October, the kind of night that made your breath visible with each exhale. I had been driving for hours, lost in the winding roads of a forgotten part of the country, far from any sign of civilization. My phone was out of service, and the sky above me was nothing but a heavy blanket of dark clouds. The headlights of my truck cut through the fog, illuminating only a few feet ahead, making the journey feel like it would never end. I had come to this remote part of Maine for some solitude. The house I rented had been advertised as a cozy cabin, nestled away from the world. I had been needing a break, a chance to clear my head after months of work stress and personal drama. When I finally pulled up to the place, it looked, well, not exactly how I imagined. The cabin sat on the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to sway unnaturally in the wind. It was old, no doubt about it, and not in a charming, rustic way, but in a way that felt abandoned. The paint on the exterior was peeling, the wooden shutters hanging crookedly, and the porch steps were covered in a thick layer of mildew. The place seemed like it had been forgotten by time itself, but I figured it was part of the charm. I grabbed my bag from the truck and walked up the creaky steps, the wood beneath my feet groaning with each step. The door was unlocked, and as I stepped inside, the musty smell of damp wood and stale air hit me immediately. The room was dim, lit only by the faint light from the storm outside. The furniture was old and worn, as though it hadn't been touched in years. Dust covered every surface, and there were cobwebs in the corners of the room. I set my bag down by the door and went to explore. The kitchen was small, with rusty appliances and a sink full of dishes that looked as if they hadn't been cleaned in a long time. The living room was the same, old, faded furniture and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't seen a flame in years. The windows were thick with grime, but I could tell there were no signs of life for miles. At first, I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that had begun to creep into the back of my mind. After all, I had come here to escape, but something was off. It wasn't just the look of the place. It was the silence. No sounds of birds, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of a town or highway, just an eerie, unsettling quiet. I decided to settle in for the night. The rain started to pour down heavily, beating against the windows, and the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. I made a quick dinner and set up in front of the fireplace, lighting it for warmth. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that seemed to break the silence. The first night passed without much incident, though I didn't sleep well. The wind seemed to pick up in intensity as the night went on, and the howling outside was almost deafening at times. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I could hear the sound of footsteps outside, though when I checked, nothing was there. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. The next morning, I decided to get some fresh air. The storm had passed, leaving the ground wet and slippery, and the sky was a dull gray. I walked through the woods behind the cabin, following a small trail that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. The trees here were thick and tangled, casting long shadows over the path. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I told myself it was just my nerves. As I walked, I noticed something odd. There were markings on some of the trees, strange symbols carved into the bark. They weren't just random scratches. They seemed deliberate, like they had a meaning. I couldn't decipher them, but they sent a chill down my spine. I kept walking, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut that something was wrong. Eventually, I came to a clearing, and in the center of it stood something I hadn't expected. A small, run-down shed. The wood was rotting, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, but it seemed too out of place in the middle of the forest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I approached it, my steps slow and deliberate. I pushed the door open, and inside, I found nothing but old, broken furniture and empty shelves. But then my eyes fell on something in the corner, a large, rusted metal box. It looked like it had been there for years, covered in dirt and cobwebs. I knelt down to inspect it, and as my hand brushed the lid, I felt a jolt of fear. It was cold, almost unnaturally so. I opened the box, and inside was something that made my heart race. A bundle of old, faded photographs. I took them out, and as I flipped through the pictures, my stomach dropped. They were all of the cabin, of the exact same place I was staying, but there was something wrong with them. People stood in the photos, smiling at the camera, but their faces were blurred, like something had been deliberately erased. In the background of one of the photos, I could make out a figure in the distance, a dark shape standing near the woods, just barely visible. I dropped the photos in shock, my hands trembling. I had to get out of there. I didn't know what I had just stumbled upon, but it was clear that something had happened here, something that I didn't want to be a part of. I turned to leave, but as I did, I noticed something else. A faint set of footprints leading away from the shed, heading back toward the cabin. I followed them, heart pounding in my chest, until I reached the cabin once again. As I approached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it when I left. Hesitating, I slowly pushed it open, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. The fire in the fireplace had been put out, but the room was no longer empty. A chair by the window was overturned, and the air was thick with an unsettling energy. My bag was on the floor. Scattered around it were small, strange items, stones, feathers, and pieces of cloth. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A shadow. It was like the figure in the photographs had come to life. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long, spindly arms that seemed to stretch toward me as if reaching out. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place as I stared at it. The shadow didn't move, but I could feel its presence, pressing in on me from all sides. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and bolted for the door, not stopping until I was back in my truck. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and I didn't look back. As I drove away, the storm picked up again, but this time I didn't care. The cabin, the shed, the photographs, it was all behind me now. I didn't know what had happened there or who had been living there before me, but one thing was clear. I wasn't meant to stay there. I wasn't meant to uncover whatever had happened in that place. The woods would keep their secrets, and I would keep mine. I never went back to that cabin. I don't think I ever could. Some places are meant to be left forgotten, lost in the woods, just as they were before. The memories of what I saw will stay with me, but I'm never going near that place again. It was late autumn, the kind of chill that cuts through your jacket and makes you long for the warmth of a fire. The cabin I'd rented was tucked deep in the Yorkshire moors, miles from any real town, in a place that felt almost forgotten by the world. I was 28 years old, just looking for some time alone to reset, escape the noise of the city, and disconnect for a few days. I'd been working in London for a while, in a job that had started to drain me, and I figured a few quiet days in a secluded cabin would help me find some clarity. I was wrong. The cabin itself was small but comfortable, nestled at the edge of a forest that stretched for miles in every direction. The wind was picking up, and the trees groaned and creaked like they were trying to warn me about something. But I brushed off the strange feeling in my gut. I'd rented the place online and everything looked fine. The interior was cozy enough, with stone walls and a fireplace that would crackle with warmth once I got it going. I spent the first day exploring the grounds. Nothing but the faint sound of birds and the rustling of leaves underfoot. It felt peaceful, and I'd convinced myself that I had made the right choice. The first night, however, was when things took a turn. I'd finished my dinner early and sat by the fire, flipping through a book I'd brought with me. But the house was so quiet, eerily quiet. The wind outside whistled through the cracks in the windows, but inside, there wasn't a sound. No creaks in the floorboards, no animals scratching at the walls. Nothing. Just the fire crackling in the hearth. Around 9:30, I decided to turn in. The bed was comfortable, and after a few minutes, I found myself drifting off. I woke up in the middle of the night, my body rigid. I didn't know what had caused me to wake up, but the room felt off. Something wasn't right. I lay still for a few moments, listening. The wind was howling outside, but there was something else. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. At first, I couldn't place it. It was like a faint scraping, followed by a small thud. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling, but then I heard it again, louder this time. Scrape, thud, scrape, thud. My heart began to race. I got up quietly and grabbed a flashlight, feeling a sudden irrational need to investigate. My eyes were still adjusting to the darkness as I crept toward the window. Outside, the moonlight barely broke through the thick clouds. I couldn't see much, just the silhouettes of trees, twisting in the wind. But something moved among them. I squinted harder, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't an animal. It was a woman, a figure standing unnaturally still, almost as if she were waiting. Her hair was long and matted, hanging in front of her face like a veil. Her clothes were ragged, and she stood there, completely motionless, staring into the cabin. My pulse shot up, and I took an involuntary step back, my breath shaky. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like an eternity before the woman finally moved. She took a slow step, then another, and started walking toward the cabin. I froze, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. I couldn't explain it, but something told me I wasn't safe. She was still far enough away that I could lock the doors and windows, but the thought of her being out there, in the dark, set my nerves on fire. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I grabbed my phone, trying to dial the number for the rental company, but there was no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere. I looked around the room, trying to find some way to protect myself. The fireplace poker seemed like the only reasonable option, so I grabbed it, my hands trembling. The thudding noise outside was louder now. It wasn't coming from the woman, but from the other side of the cabin. Someone or something was moving around the back. I was sure of it. Scrape, thud, scrape, thud. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept to the back door, flashlight in hand, shining it cautiously out the small window. I saw nothing at first. The darkness was thick, impenetrable. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her again. The woman. She was standing at the far end of the cabin, near the woodshed, just watching. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. The thought of opening the door and confronting her made my skin crawl, but I couldn't just stay inside. I needed to know who she was, why she was there. With my hand on the doorknob, I hesitated, but the scraping sound was getting closer. I had no choice but to open it. Slowly, cautiously, I turned the knob and stepped outside. The air was thick with fog, and the world around me was swallowed by the mist. I could barely make out the shape of the cabin in front of me, and for a moment, I wondered if the woman had vanished. But then I saw her again, this time closer, just standing at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out her face, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold and piercing. The hair hanging over her face seemed to move, almost as if it were alive, blowing in the wind, but she didn't move. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, but my body froze. The woman was too close, and I wasn't sure if she was dangerous or just lost. I wanted to run, but the fear of what she might do stopped me. It was then that I heard the second set of footsteps, heavy, purposeful. They weren't from the woman. I spun around, heart slamming against my chest, and saw a man, tall, wearing a hooded jacket, and his face obscured in shadow. He wasn't smiling. Panic surged through me. I knew I had to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like my body was paralyzed with fear. The woman finally spoke, her voice a rasp, barely audible over the wind. "Go inside, now." I didn't question it. I turned and bolted back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me. I locked every window and door, feeling my hands shake as I fumbled with the latches. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any signs of movement outside. But nothing came. The wind howled, the trees creaked, and I eventually drifted off, exhausted and shaken, my mind still racing. The next morning, I left the cabin as soon as the sun rose. I didn't bother with breakfast or packing properly. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was driving down the narrow dirt road leading away from the cabin, I passed a small village. I stopped at a gas station and asked an older woman behind the counter if she knew anything about the cabin I'd rented. She looked at me strangely. "You're lucky you got out," she said, shaking her head. "That place has been abandoned for years, but there's been talk of someone who lives in the woods now. No one knows exactly who they are, but they say she's been there for a long time. People avoid the area. You're not the first to have trouble with her." I didn't know if I believed her, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going back to find out. And as I drove away, the wind howling in the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching, waiting. The sun was beginning to set behind the hills as I pulled my truck up the narrow, gravel road that led to the old farmhouse. The tires kicked up a cloud of dust, and the sound of the engine sputtering to a halt echoed in the empty space. I didn't mind the isolation. It had been exactly what I needed after months of nonstop work, endless meetings, and the constant hum of city life. The cabin was a small, two-bedroom house that my uncle had left me after he passed away. He'd lived out here for years, tending to the farm, and though I'd never been close with him, I figured a weekend away in the middle of nowhere would help me reset. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and looked around, taking in the solitude. There were no neighbors for miles, just rolling fields, a few sparse trees, and the barn in the distance, which looked as though it hadn't been used in years. The cabin itself looked weathered but sturdy, with its peeling red paint and the faint smell of wood smoke still hanging in the air. Felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I unloaded my things, the door creaking as I pushed it open. The cabin was simple, wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a rustic kitchen. The furniture was old, mismatched, but comfortable. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what I needed. After spending a few minutes unpacking, I decided to take a walk around the property. The evening was cool, the air crisp with the smell of pine and fresh earth. I walked toward the barn, my boots crunching on the dirt path, and noticed that the door was slightly ajar. It looked like it hadn't been opened in a while. The hinges were rusty, and the wood around the edges was rotting. Still, curiosity got the best of me, and I gently pushed the door open. The inside was dark, musty, and filled with the scent of old hay and decaying wood. There were boxes stacked against the far wall, some torn open, others covered in thick layers of dust. It didn't look like anything had been touched in years. But then I noticed something odd. A pair of boots, old and weathered, sitting in the corner near a pile of rags. They didn't belong to anyone I knew. I frowned, walking over to get a closer look. The boots were caked with mud, the laces frayed. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know why, but the sight of those boots unsettled me. I turned to leave the barn, but just as I was about to step back into the sunlight, I heard a noise. It was faint, almost like a whisper. I paused, straining my ears. The sound came again, this time clearer, like something scraping against the walls. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The last thing I wanted was to spook myself, so I shrugged it off as the wind or an animal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to head back to the cabin and relax for the evening. After a quick dinner of canned beans and a beer, I settled into the armchair by the fireplace, the flames crackling softly in the hearth. The house felt warm, comforting, but there was still that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, like I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, but as the night deepened and the house grew quieter, I heard something again. It started as a soft thump, almost like someone knocking on the door. I paused, straining to listen. Then, there was another thump, louder this time, followed by a series of quick footsteps outside. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and went to the door, slowly opening it to look around. The night air was thick with fog now, and I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. I called out, my voice shaky. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" Silence. I stepped outside, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the fog. Nothing. No movement, no sign of life. I was about to close the door when I noticed something strange. On the ground, just at the base of the porch steps, was a small pile of dirt. But it wasn't just dirt. It was fresh. And as I bent down to take a closer look, I saw something buried beneath it. Something that looked like a bone. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, heart pounding in my chest. The ground felt unstable beneath my feet, as if the earth itself was shifting. I quickly ran inside and locked the door behind me, my mind racing. What the hell was going on here? I looked out the window, but there was nothing to see. The fog had thickened, and the night seemed unnaturally still. I didn't know how long I sat there, trying to calm myself down. My head was spinning, and every little sound seemed to send me into a panic. I thought about leaving, driving back to town and calling it a night, but something kept me there. Something was telling me that I needed to stay to figure out what was going on. I decided to investigate further. I grabbed a shovel from the shed and made my way back to the spot where I'd found the bone. The fog was still dense, wrapping around me like a thick blanket. My footsteps were muffled by the soft earth, and I felt a strange sense of urgency in my chest. As I dug into the ground, the dirt felt unusually heavy, as though I was digging into something that wasn't meant to be unearthed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I uncovered something. It was a small, rusted tin box, its edges sharp and jagged. I pulled it out of the hole, my hands trembling as I pried it open. Inside was a collection of old photographs, some fading with age, others stained with what looked like dirt or blood. I flipped through them quickly. Pictures of my uncle in his younger days, working on the farm, standing by the barn, posing with a man I didn't recognize. Then, I came across something that made my stomach lurch. A photo of a woman, her face obscured by shadow, standing near the cabin. My head was spinning. I couldn't make sense of any of this. But I knew one thing: I needed to leave. Now, I gathered my things, barely stopping to pack my bag. The adrenaline was pumping through my veins as I rushed to start my truck. I didn't care about the farm, about the cabin, about anything else. I just needed to get out of there before whatever was haunting that place came after me. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was barely visible through the fog, but I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the window. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, not daring to look back again. The road ahead was long, but I didn't care. I wasn't going back. I wasn't ever going back. It was late September, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn, when I found myself driving down an old, overgrown dirt road. My destination? A secluded cabin in the woods, far from the reach of modern life. I had rented it for a weekend getaway, needing some time to unwind after months of relentless work. The idea of being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees, was supposed to be peaceful, but I should have known better than to expect peace. The cabin was smaller than I had imagined, tucked away in the crook of a large hill. Its weathered wooden exterior looked like it had seen better days. The shingles on the roof curled and faded. A small creek babbled nearby, and I could hear the rustling of branches in the wind. I could already feel a sense of isolation setting in, though I tried to shake it off as I pulled up to the front door. Inside, the cabin was quaint. It smelled of pine and dust, with an old stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The furniture was basic: 2 chairs, a wooden table, a couple of old lamps with dim bulbs, and a dusty old rug that hadn't seen a vacuum in decades. The place had a certain charm to it, but also a sense of neglect. I checked the kitchen, finding nothing but the essentials: a sink, a stove, a fridge stocked with basic food items, mostly canned goods and some stale bread. I set my things down and tried to relax. The sun was setting, and I made myself a small dinner. The creek outside gurgled peacefully, and all seemed quiet, until the silence was broken by a strange sound. It was faint, distant, almost like a low thud. I stood still, straining my ears. At first, I thought it might have been a deer or some other animal, but the sound came again. Louder this time. A steady thump, thump, thump. It was coming from behind the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The night was dark, the sky clouded over with no moon to guide me. The wind had died down, and everything felt unnervingly still. I scanned the area behind the cabin, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving me in uneasy silence. Just an animal, I muttered to myself, trying to calm my nerves. But the thumping came again. This time it was louder, closer. It sounded like something, or someone, was knocking on the back door of the cabin. I hesitated. I knew there was no one around for miles. No neighbors, no other cabins, nothing. Still, I approached the back door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The thumping stopped the moment I reached the door. The quiet felt suffocating, and I had the distinct impression that someone, or something, was watching me. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then I pulled open the door, expecting to find nothing but empty darkness. But there, just beyond the threshold, was something strange. A faint, uneven trail of footprints, leading away from the door and into the woods. My stomach dropped. The prints were too fresh, too recent to be from an animal. They were human. I stepped back, slamming the door shut behind me. My mind raced. Who would be out there? Why would they be coming to the cabin in the middle of the night? I checked the windows, but everything was dark outside. The forest was silent once more. I spent the rest of the evening in a paranoid daze. I kept the lights on, locked every door and window, and even pulled the curtains shut. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But every little creak of the cabin, every rustling branch outside, made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I finally managed to drift off into an uneasy sleep. But my rest was short-lived. I woke to the sound of something moving around outside. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching in the dry leaves. I shot up, panic setting in as I tried to make sense of what was happening. My mind raced, thinking about all the possible explanations. Could be a hunter, someone who had gotten lost, or maybe even someone who had been following me. The thought made me feel vulnerable, exposed. I grabbed the flashlight again and crept toward the window. I could barely make out the figure in the distance. A tall, lanky man, his silhouette blending in with the darkness. He was standing by the creek, staring toward the cabin. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't move for what felt like hours, watching him as he didn't move an inch. Then, suddenly, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the thick forest like a shadow. I stood there for a long time, not daring to move. It wasn't until the first light of dawn crept through the trees that I finally took a shaky breath and made my way to the door. I knew I couldn't stay another minute. I packed my things quickly, my hands trembling as I shoved clothes and supplies into my bag. I checked the cabin one last time, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything. But as I was about to leave, I heard the sound of something scraping against the doorframe. I turned to see something horrifying: scratches, long and deep, gouged into the wood. The marks were fresh, and they looked like they had been made by something sharp. I backed away, my heart racing. The thought of being trapped in that cabin with whatever had been out there sent a wave of panic through me. I bolted out the door and ran to my car as fast as I could. The engine roared to life the moment I turned the key, and I drove out of there without looking back. The drive home was a blur, my mind still racing with fear and confusion. When I finally reached my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I checked the locks on my doors twice, made sure every window was secure, and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. But the memories of that night, of the footsteps, the scratches, the man in the woods, stayed with me. And for weeks after, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to return. I've never gone back to that cabin, and I never will. I don't care if it was a hunter or a random stranger. It doesn't matter. The terror I felt that night was real, and I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting for someone else to stumble across it. The air had a strange chill to it as I drove up the narrow dirt road toward the cabin. It had been years since I'd gone hunting, but something about the solitude was calling to me. I needed the break, the silence, the chance to get away from the noise of everyday life. The cabin, tucked deep in the woods of northern Maine, was a place my father had taken me to when I was younger. It had been years since anyone had used it, and I'd been wanting to get back there for a while. It was late October, and the trees around me were heavy with autumn colors. The orange and yellow leaves fluttered around the windshield, but I could see the cabin in the distance, standing like a shadow against the darkening sky. I pulled up to the old wooden structure, the kind that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The place was simple, one story with a stone chimney and an old wooden porch. I grabbed my gear, including my rifle and a duffel bag packed with enough supplies to last me the weekend, and made my way to the door. Creaked as I opened it. The inside was dusty, but it was warm. A few boards on the floor had warped over time, and the furniture had seen better days. The smell of old wood and something faintly musty hit me. I wasn't sure if it was the scent of the cabin itself or just the air that had been stagnant for so long. I set my stuff down on the table and went about starting a fire in the stone hearth. The crackling flames were the only sound for a while, and I sat there staring into them. I could hear the wind whistling through the trees outside, a distant reminder of how isolated I really was. The first night passed without incident. I had a decent dinner of canned stew and sat up late, reading a book I'd brought along. The fire had died down, and the cabin was quiet again. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful if I'm being honest. There's something unnerving about complete silence when you're in the middle of nowhere. But I chalked it up to the solitude and settled into bed, pulling the thick blanket over me for warmth. I woke up the next morning with the sunlight streaming through the gaps in the shutters. My breath was visible in the air, a sign that the temperature had dropped significantly overnight. I got up, stretched, and stepped outside to take in the crisp morning. The world outside was still, the forest beyond the cabin completely quiet except for the occasional chirp of birds. The air smelled clean, fresh, a stark contrast to the old mustiness inside. I ate a quick breakfast of canned beans and packed my gear for the hunt. I wasn't expecting to bag anything huge, but I figured it would be good to get out there and try. I grabbed my rifle, strapped my knife to my belt, and set off into the woods. The leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the light broke through the trees in uneven patches. The deeper I went, the more I realized how quiet it was. It wasn't just peaceful, it was dead silent. No squirrels scurrying, no birds calling. Nothing. I brushed it off as maybe the time of year, but the stillness felt wrong. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I pushed forward, trying to shake off the odd feeling. After a few hours, I found a good spot near a ridge where I could sit and wait. I wasn't really expecting much, but figured it would be good to have a place to rest. As I settled in, I noticed something odd. There were no animal tracks in the dirt. I had expected to see something. There were signs of trees being gnawed on and the occasional pile of scat, but nothing that looked recent. It seemed like all life had simply vanished. I waited for a while, but nothing came. I started to feel frustrated and uneasy. I decided to head back to the cabin for the night. The whole walk back felt off. It was like the woods were watching me, like there was something hidden just beyond my line of sight, waiting. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me. Footsteps, maybe, but when I turned around, there was nothing. When I made it back to the cabin, the sense of unease didn't leave. It was like the silence had followed me back. I started a fire again, but the crackling of the logs couldn't drown out the feeling gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the idea that something was wrong with these woods. That night, the cabin felt colder than usual. I couldn't get comfortable. I tossed and turned, eventually falling into a light, restless sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise, a thud, a scrape against the wall, like something heavy being dragged along the ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to hear through the stillness. It was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. I grabbed my rifle and slowly got out of bed, creeping toward the window. The fire had died down to embers, casting an eerie glow across the room. My breath came in short, fast bursts as I peered out into the darkness. The woods were still. No movement, no sound. But then I saw it. At the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the faint light from the cabin, there was something standing. A figure, tall and thin, almost unnaturally so. Its shape was barely discernible in the darkness, but there was no mistaking the way it was standing. Still, watching, I froze, unsure of what to do. My mind raced through 100 different scenarios. Was it a person? A bear? Something else entirely? But I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that figure, now barely visible in the dim light. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, and I could feel the tension building, crawling under my skin. I didn't know how long I stared at it. Seconds? Minutes? But finally, it stepped back into the darkness, vanishing from sight. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The woods were still eerily quiet, but now there was something more, an underlying sense of danger. I packed my things and decided to leave early. I didn't care about hunting anymore. I didn't want to be anywhere near that place. I loaded my rifle and headed for the truck, keeping my eyes darting from side to side, expecting something to jump out at me from the woods. When I got to the truck, I could feel my pulse racing. My hands shook as I got in and started the engine. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. As I drove down the winding road, the cabin grew smaller in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the trees, something watching me. But by the time I looked again, it was gone. By the time I reached the main road, I could breathe a little easier, but I knew I'd never forget that feeling. The feeling that something was out there, something that didn't belong in the woods, and it had been watching me the whole time. I had always thought of myself as the kind of person who could handle solitude. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, spending most of my youth in a small rural town, miles away from any form of civilization. I liked the quiet, the open skies, the wide fields, the stillness. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare me for the experience I would have one autumn night at a cabin near an old, forgotten graveyard. It started when I received an invitation from my old friend, Ben. We'd lost touch for years, but one day, out of the blue, he called. He was living in a remote part of West Virginia now, having taken up a job as a caretaker for some old estate. He had a small cabin on the grounds and thought it would be nice for me to come out for a weekend, get away from the noise of city life. I'd heard the area had a reputation. Strange things were said to happen out there, but as I said, I liked the quiet, the isolation. It wasn't until I arrived that I started to understand why people might be wary. The road leading up to Ben's cabin was narrow and winding, flanked on both sides by dense woods that seemed to close in, like they were hiding something. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Ben wasn't home when I arrived, but he'd left a note telling me where to find the key. The cabin was small but comfortable, with a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The air was cool even for late October, but the place had a warmth to it. I settled in, starting a fire, and unpacked my things. There was a chill in the air, but the crackling of the logs was comforting, the only sound breaking the silence. As the night wore on, I got the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the sense of unease that crept in as the wind howled outside. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, but something kept pulling my attention to the window. There was a small cemetery on the edge of the property, visible from the cabin's porch. I had noticed it on my way in but hadn't thought much about it at first. A few rows of old gravestones, weathered by years of exposure, their markings barely legible. What struck me as odd, though, was the fact that some of the gravestones appeared to have been recently disturbed, as if someone had been digging around in the earth. Curiosity got the better of me, and around midnight, I decided to take a closer look. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my jacket, and stepped outside. The ground was damp beneath my boots as I walked towards the cemetery, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the fog that had rolled in from the woods. The air smelled of wet earth, the familiar scent of autumn decay. As I got closer, I noticed more disturbing things. There were marks in the soil, freshly dug earth, and several stones had been moved aside. My flashlight beam flickered as I shone it across the graves. Then something caught my eye, a figure, just at the edge of my light, standing still among the gravestones. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of someone standing motionless, barely visible in the darkness. At first, I thought it was Ben, maybe messing around, but then I remembered he hadn't been back yet. The figure didn't move, just stood there like it was waiting for something, waiting for me. I tried calling out, but my voice felt small, swallowed by the vastness of the night. The figure didn't respond, didn't even flinch. I started to back away slowly, telling myself it was probably some sort of local prank or someone from the nearby town out for a walk. But the feeling in my gut told me that wasn't the case. As I turned to leave, the air around me grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. I quickened my pace, moving back toward the cabin as fast as I could, my pulse racing. When I reached the porch, I dared to look back. The figure was gone, no trace of it. I breathed a sigh of relief, shaking my head, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I rushed inside, locked the door, and sat by the fire trying to calm down. The house felt different now, the warmth of the fire suddenly colder. I kept hearing noises, scraping, tapping, faint footsteps. At first, I convinced myself it was just the wind, or maybe a loose shutter banging against the cabin, but the sounds were too deliberate, too close. They came from upstairs. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hands shaking as I ascended the narrow staircase. The beam of light trembled, illuminating old wooden beams and dusty furniture, but nothing else. The door to the bedroom was ajar. I stood there for a moment, listening. Silence. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking. The room was empty, but the atmosphere felt thick, oppressive. Something in the corner of my eye caught my attention, a glint of something on the floor. I knelt down and saw what it was. A small silver locket, half buried in the dust. I picked it up, feeling the cool metal in my hand. It wasn't mine, and it definitely hadn't been there when I arrived. Inside was a photo, old, faded, but clearly of a woman. Her eyes stared out from the frame, dark and empty, the kind of eyes that could freeze you in place. I stood up, my heart racing, the room suddenly too small, too suffocating. I felt an overwhelming urge to get out of there. I made my way back downstairs, grabbed my things, and went to the door. And then I saw it, the figure from the cemetery, standing in the window. Not far from me now, but this time I could see its features. A woman, tall and gaunt, her hair long and unkempt. Her face was pale, stretched thin. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me through the glass, her eyes hollow, unblinking. I bolted for the door, my mind screaming to leave. As I reached for the handle, the room seemed to shake. The floor beneath me groaned. The walls creaked. I twisted the doorknob desperately, but it wouldn't open. Then, just as quickly as it all began, the door swung open. The air outside felt cold, but it didn't matter. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the end of the property. my heart pounding in my chest, my legs burning. I didn't know what happened to that woman, or who or what she was. Maybe it was all in my head, the isolation playing tricks on me. But one thing was clear: whatever was out there in that graveyard had a way of making you feel like you weren't alone. I never went back. The wind howled through the towering trees, rattling the wooden window frames of the cabin. My breath fogged up the glass as I stared into the pitch-black forest beyond. It was late autumn in the northern woods of Michigan, and the crisp air carried the smell of damp leaves and decaying wood. The trees had shed their leaves days ago, leaving behind the skeletons of towering pines and oak trees. I was alone, a park ranger stationed in this isolated cabin, surrounded by miles of wilderness. The cabin was small but sturdy, built years ago by previous rangers. It had a heavy wooden door, the kind that creaked whenever you opened or closed it, and the floors were worn smooth from years of boots shuffling across them. The walls were lined with maps and old photographs of the park, pictures of animals, trees, trails, and people. There were no fancy luxuries here, just a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a modest bed tucked into the corner by the window. A rickety table sat in the middle of the room, with a chair that creaked every time I sat in it. I had been working here for a little over 2 weeks now, taking care of the usual duties, checking the trails, maintaining the park, and watching out for campers or hikers who strayed off the path. Most of the time, things were quiet. That's the way I liked it. I was used to the silence, the isolation. But tonight, there was something different. Something in the air felt off. The first sign came when I was sitting at the table, sipping my coffee and flipping through some paperwork. I heard a faint knock at the door. 3 quick, almost frantic taps. I froze. Nobody came up this far unless they had a good reason, usually hikers or hunters who had gotten lost or needed assistance. But it was nearly midnight, and the last person I had seen was a family of 4 who passed through earlier in the afternoon. I got up, cautiously moving toward the door. My hand brushed against the cold metal of my flashlight hanging from the hook by the door. I grabbed it, flicking it on. I stood there for a moment, listening. The wind howled again, louder now, but there was nothing else. No footsteps, no rustling, no sound of an animal. I slowly opened the door. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but a wall of trees. The silence outside was oppressive, and the chill in the air felt different, almost unnatural. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding smaller than I meant it to. No reply. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the surrounding woods with the flashlight. The forest looked wrong somehow. It was too still, too quiet. The wind had died down completely, and the usual rustling of leaves or movement of animals was gone. Not a single owl hooted, no raccoons scurried through the underbrush. Just emptiness. I felt a shiver run up my spine as I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me. I locked it just in case. There was no logical reason for me to be worried, but the strange feeling wouldn't go away. My instincts told me that something was off. I tried to shake it off. I turned on the radio for some background noise, hoping it would help distract me. The static buzzed through the room before the faint voice of a weather announcer crackled in. "Storm warning, heavy winds, possible flooding, keep safe." I zoned out, letting the hum of the radio settle in my mind, but my gaze kept drifting to the window, the darkness beyond. It was about 1:30 a.m. when I heard it again. A knock at the door, just as faint and quick as before. I stiffened, heart pounding in my chest. This time, I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my flashlight and gun, feeling the weight of it in my hand as I approached the door. I was armed, but the fear creeping into my chest made me question if that would be enough. I didn't know what I was facing. I opened the door again, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there, just the same forest stretching out in all directions. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A set of footprints in the dirt leading toward the cabin. They were fresh, the outlines still crisp despite the fading moonlight. The steps were irregular, not quite human, more like someone had been dragging their feet. I took a deep breath, telling myself to stay calm. Maybe it was some kind of animal, or perhaps someone was playing a prank. But the more I looked at the prints, the more they unsettled me. They didn't make sense. The depth of the impressions was inconsistent, like they weren't from someone walking normally. I hesitated, but I knew I couldn't just ignore this. I had to investigate. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, keeping the flashlight low to the ground as I followed the strange prints into the woods. The air was growing colder, and the silence seemed to weigh heavier with every step I took. The flashlight beam danced across the uneven ground, catching small patches of ice on the rocks and shrubs. The further I went, the more the prints seemed to wind in odd directions, almost as if they were leading me somewhere. The trail ended at a large, fallen log. I scanned the area around me with the flashlight, but there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of trees. The feeling of being watched washed over me, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, the hair-raising sound of something cracking underfoot echoed from behind me. My heart skipped a beat as I spun around, flashlight pointed at the sound. My breath caught in my throat. There was nothing there. The forest was still. I started backing up toward the cabin, my eyes darting around, scanning every movement, every shadow. The sound of footsteps behind me seemed to echo from the woods, but when I turned, there was nothing. It was all in my head, I told myself, but the unease had settled deep in my bones. I made it back to the cabin, locking the door behind me once again. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone in these woods. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the unease never left. I stayed up, my eyes flicking nervously toward the door and window. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, hunted even. I'd never felt that way before, not even during the stormy nights I'd spent out here years ago. When morning came, the sky was clear, but the feeling of dread didn't lift. I checked the trail again, only to find that the footprints had disappeared, as if they had never been there at all. The ground was undisturbed, not a trace of the strange marks I had seen the night before. The storm passed, and I resumed my duties, but my thoughts often wandered back to that night. Was it a prank? A figment of my imagination? Or something else entirely? I never saw anything or anyone again after that. But every time I step outside the cabin now, I can't help but feel that I'm being watched from the edge of the trees. The memory of that strange night lingers in the back of my mind, and I've learned to never fully trust the silence of the woods. Something out there is waiting, and it knows where I am. I had been living in the cabin for a few weeks now. It was a small, secluded place tucked away in the dense forest, miles from the nearest town. The kind of cabin you only find if you actively seek it out. The world outside was loud, chaotic, but here it was just the hum of the trees and the chirping of the birds. No distractions, no one to bother me. I wanted to get away from it all. I needed it. My dog, Max, a big, burly German shepherd, had been my only companion. He was loyal, protective, always keeping me company while I built a life in this cabin. The first few days had been peaceful, calm, but then something started to feel off. It was late October, the kind of chill in the air that hinted at the approaching winter. Max and I had spent most of the day hiking through the woods, exploring the same trails I'd walked every day since I arrived. But that afternoon, Max had been acting strange. He'd kept his nose to the ground, sniffing obsessively at the air. His ears perked up at every rustling leaf. I didn't think much of it. Dogs get jumpy, right? I figured he'd heard a deer or some other animal, maybe even a squirrel scurrying around. But the unease gnawed at me. By nightfall, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the cabin. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting long shadows on the walls. Max lay beside me, staring intently at the door. He wouldn't settle, his eyes locked on the wooden frame like he was waiting for something to come through. The sound of footsteps outside the cabin made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the wind or some animal. These were heavy, deliberate steps, slow but constant, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. Max was up in an instant, his low growl vibrating through the room. I grabbed the flashlight beside me, my grip tightening around the handle. I tried to keep calm. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe it was someone lost in the woods. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The footsteps didn't sound like any person I'd ever heard before. They were too heavy, too deliberate. "Stay," I whispered to Max as I stood up, moving cautiously toward the door. He growled louder, his teeth bared, clearly not willing to let me go out there alone. But I needed to know what was going on. I had to see for myself. I opened the door just a crack, peering through the gap, flashlight in hand. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing, just the empty, moonlit clearing around the cabin. But then I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes just behind the cabin. The same slow, deliberate steps. My heart pounded in my chest as I swung the door open fully. I called Max to my side, and we stepped out together into the cold night air, the flashlight beam flickering over the ground. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but the longer we stood there, the more the forest felt alive with hidden movement. The wind picked up again, and I thought I heard the sound of someone breathing just behind the trees. Max's hackles were raised, his body tense, and his eyes darted around, scanning the shadows like he could see something I couldn't. His growl turned into a low bark, short and sharp. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it movement in the trees just beyond the range of the flashlight. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. Whatever it was too quick, too silent. I didn't have time to process it before Max broke free of my grip and charged into the woods. "Max, no!" I yelled, running after him. I chased him through the trees, my flashlight now bouncing wildly in my hands. The dark woods seemed endless. The only sound I could hear was Max's heavy panting and the sound of twigs cracking beneath his paws. My pulse raced, panic creeping in as I realized I had no idea where we were going. No idea where Max was leading me. Suddenly, Max stopped. He was silent, staring ahead with those piercing, intelligent eyes. His tail was tucked between his legs, his body trembling with tension. I followed his gaze, heart pounding in my chest. There, in the dim light of the flashlight, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure. Not a person, not an animal, but a shape tall, thin, and unnatural. It was standing in the clearing ahead, its body long and sinewy, like a man, but its movements were erratic, unnatural. It was crouching, its face obscured by shadows, but its presence was unmistakable. Max growled low again, and I instinctively took a step back. The figure tilted its head toward us. For a moment, it just stood there, unmoving, watching. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. There was something wrong about it, something that made my instincts scream at me to run. But I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the thing. The air seemed thicker here, colder, and I could hear my own breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure darted off into the forest, moving with terrifying speed. Max barked furiously, trying to chase it, but I grabbed his collar and held him back. Let it go, I whispered, my voice shaking. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it a person, a hunter, or something else entirely? My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation that made sense, but nothing fit. I pulled Max back toward the cabin, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground. We needed to get inside, lock the door, and wait. I wasn't staying out here any longer. When we finally made it back, I bolted the door behind us and sank down onto the floor, my breath coming out in shaky bursts. Max lay by my side, his head resting on his paws, eyes still darting toward the windows, his body tense. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made my heart race. Every time a branch cracked or the wind rustled, I was on high alert. Max never settled either. He stayed close to me, watching the door, listening intently for any sign of movement. Morning came, but the feeling of dread didn't lift. I spent the day inside, not daring to venture out. Whatever it was, I didn't want to find it again. By the next day, I had packed up and was ready to leave. I didn't trust the forest anymore. I didn't trust the silence. The woods had given me too many signs that something wasn't right. But it wasn't just the strange figure that scared me. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The feeling that whatever I had seen was still out there, waiting. Max and I left the cabin that afternoon. As I drove away, the cabin grew smaller in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the dark woods. But even as we left it behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that whatever was out there in those woods had been watching, waiting, and that it would be there, just beyond the trees, forever. I had to leave, for my own sanity, and for Max's safety. We couldn't stay in a place where the forest itself seemed to hold dark secrets, and I didn't plan to return anytime soon. Max might have been a brave dog, but even he knew when to stay away, and that, more than anything, convinced me I had made the right choice. The old cabin stood alone at the edge of the woods, its weathered logs sinking into the earth like an ancient relic. I had always wanted to get away from the noise of the city, find some peace, you know? But even after all the planning and excitement, I didn't realize how quiet and isolated this place would be. It was early October, the kind of time when the air starts to cool and the leaves turn golden and brown. I was 32, not too young, but not quite middle-aged either. Felt like the right time to take some time for myself. No distractions, just me, my dog Buddy, and the wilds of upstate New York. The cabin was an old hunting lodge, something a guy named Dan had rented to me through a mutual friend. It was about 2 hours from the nearest town, so I wasn't expecting any visitors. When I pulled up the dirt driveway, a sense of unease settled in my chest. The place looked smaller than I remembered from the pictures, almost too small, like it had shrunk over the years. The wood was darkened by years of rain, and the surrounding trees loomed over it, stretching their bare branches towards the sky. The wind rustled through the leaves, making everything feel just a bit off, but I pushed that feeling aside. I was here to relax, not get scared. Buddy, my loyal German shepherd, jumped out of the truck, his nails clicking on the gravel. I tossed him his leash and he ran straight for the cabin's front door, like he knew this was going to be an adventure. I had rented the cabin for a week, and I intended to make the most of it, even if the atmosphere felt strange. The inside was even more rustic than I had imagined. Small, with a single open room and a loft above. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, a few mismatched chairs, and a sturdy wooden table. The place smelled like wood and something earthy. A little odd, but nothing too alarming. The view from the large front window showed the dense forest stretching out before me, the kind of wilderness that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. But that was the point, right? To disconnect. I unpacked my stuff, settled Buddy onto his bed in the corner, and lit a fire. The flames crackled, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. I sat back in one of the chairs, nursing a beer, and tried to let go of the tension that had been building up for weeks. That night, things seemed to settle. The first few hours passed peacefully enough. Buddy curled up next to me, the fire crackling softly as I read a book I had brought along. I was almost asleep when Buddy suddenly bolted upright. His ears perked. He started growling softly, a low rumble that grew louder as he stared toward the front door. I froze. It was a sound I knew well. It was the kind of growl he reserved for something serious. Not a rabbit, not a squirrel. Something bigger. I got up quietly, walking over to the door, careful not to make a sound. Buddy stayed by my side, his body tense, his tail stiff. I cracked the door open just a sliver, the wind rushing in and rustling the leaves outside. Nothing seemed out of place, just the usual late-night rustling of trees. I closed the door and gave Buddy a pat on the head, trying to calm him down. But the uneasy feeling remained. Later that night, after I had turned off the lights and settled into bed, the feeling didn't go away. The wind picked up, and I could hear it howling through the trees, but something else joined it. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they crunched across the gravel driveway outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but these footsteps were too heavy, too measured. I could hear Buddy growling again, but this time it wasn't quiet. His deep, guttural growls reverberated through the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and, heart pounding, moved toward the door, barely breathing. Buddy was at the door, standing on his hind legs, his paws pressing against the wood. His ears were pinned back, his eyes wide with something that looked almost like fear. That was the moment I realized this wasn't normal. I stepped back, pacing, trying to figure out what to do. Whoever was out there, if it even was a person, wasn't supposed to be. This wasn't a place anyone just wandered to. I checked the locks on the door. They were all secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was just outside, waiting. I tried to convince myself that it was an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but Buddy wasn't fooled. I spent the rest of the night staring at the door, Buddy beside me, growling intermittently, his gaze never leaving the windows. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sun rising. The sound of birds chirping filtered in through the cracks in the cabin, but that sense of unease still clung to me. The next morning, I went outside to check the area around the cabin. There were no signs of any animals or people. The gravel driveway looked undisturbed, the trees still swaying in the early morning breeze. But when I walked around the back of the cabin, I found something that made my stomach drop. A set of fresh tire tracks cutting through the dirt at the edge of the property. They led off into the woods, and they were new, no more than a few hours old. I walked back inside, my thoughts racing. Who else could be out here? The cabin was supposed to be isolated, off the beaten path, and no one knew I was here. No one except the people I had told about the trip, and they wouldn't have come out here uninvited. The rest of the day passed slowly, every creak of the cabin and rustle of leaves making my skin crawl. Buddy refused to leave my side, even when I went to collect firewood. I set up a chair by the window to keep an eye on the driveway, but the silence outside was deafening. As dusk fell, the air seemed to get colder. I had to keep the fire roaring to stay warm. But then, around 9 p.m., I heard it again. The footsteps, slow and steady, this time much closer than before. My heart raced and Buddy's growls grew louder. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my gun from the truck, something I'd brought just in case, and waited by the door, the cold steel in my hands. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The footsteps grew closer, and I could hear them crunching in the dry leaves just outside the cabin. But when I looked through the crack in the door, all I saw was the thick, black forest beyond. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started, but Buddy was still on edge, his eyes darting around the room, never resting. I took a deep breath and opened the door slowly, keeping the gun in hand. No one was there. No sign of anyone, no tire tracks, nothing. But as I stepped out onto the porch, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single piece of paper, folded neatly, was stuck to the doorframe. It was a note. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The note was simple, just a few words written in jagged handwriting. Asterisk, you're not alone. Asterisk, that was enough. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Buddy, threw my things into the truck, and left without looking back. I never found out who was out there or what they wanted, but that note and the feeling of being watched stayed with me long after I left the cabin. Some places, no matter how beautiful they seem on the surface, hold secrets, and sometimes you're better off leaving them undisturbed. I haven't been back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. There are just some things better left unexplored. It was early autumn when I decided to take a break from my chaotic life in the city. After weeks of late nights and early mornings in front of a computer screen, I needed a complete change of pace. I found an old cabin up in the woods, remote, no neighbors for miles. It seemed perfect, just the solitude I was looking for. I rented it through an online service, not thinking much about the location. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, tucked in the hills of Montana, miles away from the nearest town. I was 29, a software developer by trade, and used to spending long hours staring at code and deadlines. The thought of spending a weekend without any digital distractions felt oddly liberating, but also a little strange. I packed my bags, grabbed my dog, Rocky, a mutt I'd rescued a couple of years back, and headed out. The drive took about 6 hours, the roads winding through forests that grew denser as I got closer to the cabin. It felt like the world was closing in on me, the only sound being the hum of my car and the occasional bark from Rocky in the back seat. By the time I arrived, the sun had just begun to dip below the horizon. The cabin was a small, weathered structure with peeling paint and an old stone chimney. It had seen better days, but it had its charm. There was a wide porch with a couple of old rocking chairs and a small fire pit just beyond the cabin. The surrounding woods were thick, and the quiet was almost suffocating. As I unloaded the car and Rocky bounded out to explore, I noticed the air had a dampness to it, as if rain had just passed through. The smell of pine and wet earth mixed in the cool evening breeze. Inside the cabin, the air was musty, but the place seemed solid. It was furnished with basic, rustic pieces. A wooden table, a few mismatched chairs, a stone fireplace, and a couple of old couches. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and the floors creaked underfoot. There was an old map of the area pinned on the wall next to the door, showing hiking trails and landmarks that I had no intention of visiting. I figured I'd spend my days reading and relaxing by the fire. I quickly settled in, made a fire in the hearth, and opened a bottle of wine I had brought along. Rocky curled up in his bed near the fire, and I felt the weight of the past few months start to melt away. The first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple dinner, opened a book, and let the crackling of the fire soothe me to sleep. But the next morning, things started to feel off. It was still early when I woke up, the light just starting to creep through the cabin's dusty windows. I was alone in the cabin, the stillness broken only by the occasional sound of Rocky shifting on the floor. But as I went to grab a cup of coffee, I noticed something strange. The door to the cabin was wide open. I hadn't left it open. I was sure of that. When I had gone to bed the night before, the door had been securely latched. It wasn't just cracked. It was fully open, as if someone had come in during the night. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart pounding. Could have been the wind, I told myself. The wind could have opened it, right? Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that gnawed at me. I quickly closed the door, double-checked the lock, and went outside to check around the cabin. There were no signs of anyone. No footprints in the dirt, no broken branches, nothing. But something felt off. Rocky, usually the first to bark at anything unusual, was quiet, staring at the woods as though he was waiting for something. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably nothing. But later that evening, things took a darker turn. It was around dusk when I noticed something in the trees' movement just beyond the edge of the cabin's clearing. At first, I thought it was a deer or perhaps another animal, but it didn't move like one. It was slower, deliberate. My heart rate quickened as I watched, trying to make out what it was. Then there was a knock at the door, just one, soft but distinct. I wasn't expecting anyone. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and the road up here wasn't the kind of place people just wandered down. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a kitchen knife, and slowly approached the door. My hand hovered over the handle, the quiet outside suffocating. Another knock, this time a little more insistent. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and opened the door. There was no one there, not a soul in sight. The strange feeling in my gut had grown stronger, and Rocky was now standing beside me, growling softly, his fur bristling. The woods beyond the porch were silent, almost too silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. I closed the door quickly, checked the locks again, and leaned against the wall. My mind raced. Could it have been some kind of prank? Maybe someone was out there messing with me. But that didn't explain the strange movement in the trees. It didn't explain the way Rocky had acted. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing things. Scratches on the door, light tapping against the walls, the unmistakable sound of something moving around outside. Each time I checked, there was nothing there, but the noises continued, growing more frequent, more desperate. At one point, I must have nodded off because I woke to the sound of Rocky barking. It was frantic, filled with a terror I'd never heard from him before. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and ran into the living room. Rocky was standing at the window, his hackles raised, his barking echoing through the cabin. I rushed over and pulled back the curtain, but there was nothing out there, just the dark expanse of the forest, stretching as far as I could see. The cabin suddenly felt too small, the walls closing in around me. I was trapped. I don't know how long I stayed there, staring out into the darkness, but eventually, the barking stopped. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night, and when the sun finally came up, it felt like a relief. I packed my things, grabbed Rocky, and left the cabin without a second thought. I didn't even lock the door behind me. The drive back to town was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me during those days in the cabin. I never went back. I tried to find out more about the cabin afterward, but the rental company gave me no answers. The place didn't exist in any of the records I could find. It was as though the cabin had vanished off the face of the earth. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I've never been able to forget the feeling that I was being hunted. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from any other houses, surrounded by tall pines that blocked out the sky like a thick, unyielding curtain. It was an old cabin, one my grandmother had inherited when I was just a kid. I hadn't seen her in years, not since I was a teenager. But when I got the call that she had passed, I had to come back. I didn't want to, didn't even feel like I could be in the same room as her body. But the thought of everything being left behind, of the house and her belongings scattered in a place I used to love, drew me back. I hadn't been there in a long time. The cabin had been a place of happy memories. The smell of wood and earth, the crackle of firewood in the fireplace, the faint sound of birds in the trees. Grandma used to tell me stories about the land, about how she had built the cabin from scratch with my granddad, about how the place was a safe haven, a sanctuary. But now, standing in front of it, I felt nothing but dread. It was early afternoon when I arrived. The trees around the cabin were so thick that they seemed to swallow the sunlight, making everything feel darker than it should. The air had that chill, the one that came just before dusk, when the world seemed to hold its breath. I parked my car at the edge of the driveway and just stood there for a moment, staring at the old wood of the cabin. It looked different now, darker, older, more decayed. The front door creaked open on its own, the wind pushing it slightly ajar. I stepped forward, my heart thudding in my chest. It had been over a decade since I had last visited. I didn't want to walk through that door again, not without Grandma in the house to greet me, her warm smile, her hand resting on her cane. But now there was only silence, the kind of heavy silence that presses down on you and doesn't let up. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me immediately. The same old smell of dust, wood, and the faint, almost sickly sweet scent of rot. It was quiet, too quiet. The wooden floors creaked under my boots as I made my way through the dim hallway, following the trail of light that snuck through the cracks in the old cabin's walls. I made my way toward the back bedroom where I knew Grandma had spent her last days. Her bed had always been by the window, and the view from it was breathtaking. An endless stretch of trees, a small clearing with a brook running through it. I had always admired that view, even as a kid. It made me feel calm. But now, as I stood in front of the door, I felt nothing but unease. The door was half open. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The air inside felt thick, oppressive. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was exactly as I remembered it, but there was a heaviness in the air, a presence that made my skin crawl. Grandma's body lay on the bed, still as death itself. She wasn't the grandmother I remembered. Her once warm, kindly face was now pale and sunken. Her skin stretched tight over the bones. Her eyes were wide open, though glassy, staring at nothing. Her hands were folded over her chest, still clutching that old, frayed shawl she always wore. I could see the faint imprint of her cane beside her on the floor, where she must have dropped it before she passed. I didn't know what to feel. Sadness, fear, guilt, or maybe just confusion. I hadn't expected her to look like this. The last time I'd seen her, she had been in a wheelchair, frail but still alive, still laughing at my terrible jokes, still telling me stories of the old days when life was simpler. But now it was just a body, an empty shell that held nothing of the woman I had known. I walked closer, my steps cautious, hesitant. The room felt colder than the rest of the cabin, and my breath came out in small clouds, like I was standing outside in the dead of winter. I didn't know why, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her body. The more I stared, the more something didn't sit right with me. Something was wrong. The room smelled too much like death, but there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of something off, like something had been burning. My eyes flicked to the window, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in the reflection. Just a flicker. But when I turned around, nothing was there. I moved closer to the bed, my hands shaking as I reached for her. I needed to close her eyes, needed to make her look peaceful, like she was just asleep. But as I touched her face, I froze. Her skin was cold, colder than it should have been. It wasn't just the chill in the room. It felt wrong, like she had been dead for longer than I realized. My heart started pounding, my head spinning as I pulled my hand back. I was about to step away when something caught my eye. The floor next to the bed was covered in what looked like dust. But no, it wasn't dust. It was ash. I bent down to take a closer look. It was scattered in small, deliberate patterns, as if something had been moved around. A trail of ash led from the window to the bed, and I felt my stomach turn. I stood up quickly, my eyes darting around the room. There was nothing in the room except for me, her body, and the faint trail of ash. The air felt suffocating now, as if I couldn't get enough air in my lungs. I backed away from the bed, my eyes still on Grandma's lifeless form. Then I heard something, a creak from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then it came again, louder this time, followed by a shuffle, like footsteps. But I was the only one here. I had checked the cabin from top to bottom when I arrived. There was no one else. I moved toward the stairs slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound came again, closer this time and unmistakably human. But there was no one. I had checked. My eyes shot to the door to the back porch, but it was still closed, locked. The feeling of dread grew heavier with every step I took toward the stairs. The footsteps continued, but they were coming from the attic now. I didn't think. I didn't care about the room anymore or the body. My instincts took over and I ran. I ran out of the room, down the hall, out the door, and into the woods. I couldn't be inside that cabin anymore. I couldn't be near that body, not with whatever it was upstairs. When I finally reached my car, I turned the key and didn't look back. My eyes were wide, my hands shaking as I drove away, speeding down the dirt road that led to the cabin. I didn't know what had happened, what I had seen, or who, or what had been upstairs. I didn't go back, not for her things, not for the house. I left it all behind. The ashes, the footsteps, the body. Whatever it was, whatever had been haunting that cabin, it was better left alone. I didn't have the strength to face it,